I am Lauren Mitchell, 36, and 5 minutes into my sister's wedding, she lifted her glass and mocked my so-called failed career while my parents smiled as if it was entertainment. The guests laughed and every eye turned to me, waiting for silence to swallow me again. But then the groom's gaze cut through the room, and in that instant, I knew the truth that would change everything. The chandeliers sparkled as I stepped into the ballroom of the Wyndham Grand in downtown Boston. My heels tapped against the polished floor, drowned out by the swell of violins and the hum of voices layered with laughter. Everywhere I looked, sequined gowns and black tuxedos shimmered beneath the light. I held my clutch tight, reminding myself that I belonged here, even if no one else thought so. At 36, I had grown used to being the afterthought, the sister in the background, but tonight the reminder felt sharper than usual. I moved toward the seating chart, displayed on an easel with gold trim. My eyes scanned slowly, hopeful despite myself. At the front, Table 1, Rachel and David. Table 2, our parents. Table 3, the bridal party. I read through line after line until finally I found it near the bottom. Table 19. The number landed heavy. I followed the markers until I reached the back of the ballroom tucked beside the swinging kitchen doors. The smell of roasted lamb drifted out each time a server pushed through trays, clattering shouts muffled behind stainless steel. My tablecloth was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched, and the hum of conversation from the front felt far away. I drew a breath and forced my face into neutrality. No one here would see me flinch. I pulled out the chair, but before I could sit, a voice rang across the room. It was Rachel, radiant in lace and satin veil cascading down her shoulders. She raised her glass, her smile broad and effortless. Her words were pitched perfectly to carry over the music. Some people think sitting in a little office counts as a career. My sister has always mistaken hard work for real success. The laughter that followed was immediate, rippling outward like a stone across water. A few guests smirked openly. Others hid their amusement behind crystal glasses. The words wrapped tight around me, louder than the violins. Rachel turned slightly, lifting her glass toward me in mock salute, her eyes glittering with the satisfaction of being center stage. My mother adjusted her necklace and pretended not to hear. My father drained half his glass of wine in silence. No one stepped in. My throat tightened, but I swallowed the rising heat. I had felt this burn before. They had always left me standing alone, and once again in front of strangers and family alike, I was painted as small. The whispers spread quickly. I heard one woman murmur that maybe there had been some mistake with my seating, though her smirk said she knew better. Another man leaned close to his wife and said he had never even known Rachel had a sister. The orchestra kept playing, but every note felt like a taunt. I pressed my hands flat against the tablecloth to steady myself. I wanted to look away, but my eyes drifted back to Rachel. She was glowing, soaking up the adoration, convinced she had won again. Then I noticed David. He had entered quietly, shaking hands, smiling with practiced ease. When his gaze swept across the ballroom, it landed on me. For a moment, the noise around us seemed to dull. His expression did not change much, but his eyes were steady, deliberate, and unmistakably aware. He had heard Rachel's words. He had seen where I was placed, and yet, unlike everyone else, he did not look at me with pity or derision. There was something else there, something measured as if he knew more than the rest of them. The glance was brief, but it was enough to remind me that I was not entirely invisible. I eased into my chair at the edge of the room, servers brushing past me with trays. My pulse began to slow, though the sting still lingered. I reached for my water glass, lifting it carefully, so my hands would not betray the tremor in my fingers. The ballroom sparkled with wealth and approval, but at the far end, I sat in the shadows, as I always had expected to be silent. I thought of all the other times I had been pushed aside, the empty chairs at graduations, the moments when my words had gone unheard. It was a pattern too familiar to ignore. I drew another breath and steadied myself. There would be a time to speak. Not now. Not in the way Rachel expected. I had learned the value of waiting, of letting silence carry its own weight. Tonight would not end the way they imagined. And as the music swelled and applause rose again for Rachel, I sat quietly in my chair, heart steady, remembering the first time my place in this family was made clear and how it had started long before this night. I was 17 the day I stood outside the high school gymnasium in our small town west of Boston. My cap balanced awkwardly on my head and my gown rustling in the wind. Rows of families filled the bleachers, waving flowers and signs, parents shouting their kids' names with pride. I searched the crowd again and again, willing myself to find the familiar outline of my father's shoulders or my mother's dark hair, but the seats I had reserved for them stayed empty. Each time I looked, the ache in my chest deepened. When my name was called, I walked across the stage to polite applause from strangers, holding the diploma in both hands, as if it were the only proof I existed. I smiled for the camera, then walked back to my chair with a hollow pit in my stomach. Later I learned where they had been. Rachel had a dance recital that same evening, a local community showcase that barely drew 100 people. My parents never hesitated. They went to her performance clapping from the front row, telling themselves I would understand. That was the first chair that stayed empty for me. The image of it burned into me, not just the absence, but the message. Rachel's little triumphs would always outweigh my milestones. At home, it was no different. My father Charles liked to remind me that I was too serious. He said leadership required charm, that a good business needed a face people could love. He would glance at Rachel and say she had that quality, a spark you could not teach. When I asked about the work behind the spark, the hours spent studying or building, he brushed it aside. People invest in personalities, not in numbers, he told me. He never realized he was erasing me with every word. My mother Evelyn handled it differently. She never said Rachel was better. Instead, she smiled thinly and whispered excuses. Your sister needs more encouragement, Lauren. She is sensitive. You are strong enough on your own. Be patient. Her tone made it sound like a compliment, but it was a dismissal, a command to shrink myself so Rachel could shine. One evening, I finally gathered the courage to share an idea I had been developing. I had drawn sketches in a notebook, a small plan for a tutoring business I could run after school, organizing other students to help younger kids. I laid it out at the dinner table, heart pounding, waiting for a flicker of interest. My father did not even look up from his paper. My mother nodded absently and then turned to Rachel, admiring a new dress she had bought for an upcoming party. The conversation shifted, laughter filled the room, and my idea dissolved into silence. I sat there with my untouched food, my throat tight, realizing again how invisible I was in my own home. The motif repeated itself so many times that it became a pattern I stopped questioning. At birthdays, I blew out candles with only neighbors in attendance, because my parents had driven Rachel to a competition across town. At school plays, I sat in the back row because my name was left off the program of volunteers, even though I had built half the sets. At every stage of my life, the chair meant for me sat empty, and no one seemed to notice. I learned to stop expecting applause. I learned to hold my head high in the silence, even as the praise flowed freely to Rachel for accomplishments far smaller than mine. She could stumble through a speech at student council and be hailed as a leader. I could win a statewide essay contest and be told that writing was a nice hobby, nothing more. The memory of those years pressed against me as I sat in the back of the ballroom, the laughter of Rachel's wedding guests, echoing the same tune I had always heard. The sting was not new. It was the echo of every empty chair, every conversation that had ended before I opened my mouth, every moment when my parents chose her over me. I sipped from my water glass and let the coolness spread across my tongue, trying to steady myself. The orchestra played louder, guests cheered. Rachel sparkled at the center of it all, and I thought of the girl I had been clutching a diploma with no one in the crowd to clap for me. I tightened my grip on the glass. The years had taught me to survive silence, but tonight silence would not be the end. I had learned to wait, to bide my time until the right moment revealed itself. The right moment was closer than anyone here imagined, and the power I carried now was nothing like the powerless girl they had left behind. The morning light spilled through the wide windows of my office in downtown Chicago, reflecting off the glass towers across the street. I leaned back in the leather chair, eyes on the skyline, but mind on the stack of papers spread across my desk. As Vice President of Finance at Northfield Capital, I carried the weight of numbers that could make or break companies, and today all those numbers funneled into one deal: $45 million. Atlas Logistics in Boston, merging with Carter Freight Holdings in New York. On paper, it was seamless. In reality, nothing could move forward without my signature. I tapped the edge of the contract with my pen, the words, "Condition Precedent," printed in sharp black ink. I had fought for that clause months earlier in a boardroom filled with men who underestimated me. Without my sign-off, the closing would freeze. Every director at Northfield knew it, every lawyer attached to the case knew it, and so did Carter Freight. That knowledge steadied me. A reminder that the girl my family dismissed as insignificant now held power over the very future of the company her new brother-in-law depended on. My phone buzzed with a new email. I clicked it absent-mindedly, expecting another update from counsel. Instead, my stomach dropped. It was a forwarded chain, a message I was never supposed to see. My sister's friends were laughing at me, their words dripping with cruelty. She is just a symbolic signature. Once the ink is dry, she is out of the picture. I froze, rereading the lines as if my eyes might be deceiving me. The bitterness rose fast, flooding my chest, until I had to stand. I walked to the window, palms pressed against the cold glass, watching cars stream down Michigan Avenue far below. To them, I was still the same girl from Boston, the sister with the small job, the one who could be used and then discarded. They had no idea that the entire merger balanced on me. The humiliation cut deep, but beneath it a sharper edge formed. I thought of Rachel's voice at the wedding mocking me in front of strangers, and now her circle mocking me behind screens. My grip tightened against the window frame. They did not see me, not really, but the truth was carved into every page of the agreement on my desk. Without me, there was no deal. Without me, Carter Freight would stall and Atlas would falter. I turned back to the desk, flipping through the contract until I found the exact section. Clause 7.3, Conditions Precedent to Closing. My signature was listed alongside the CEO of Atlas and the chairman of Carter Freight. 3 names, 3 pens. Without mine, nothing moved. I traced the letters of my name printed neatly, imagining the look on Rachel's face if she knew the power she had just dismissed as meaningless. The office door opened, and my assistant peeked in. "A courier just dropped these," she said, setting down a binder of financials. I thanked her, waiting until the door clicked shut before I let the mask slip. I sat again, the hum of the city muffled by the glass. My hand hovered over the keyboard, tempted to reply to the chain with a single sentence reminding them of who I was. But I stopped. Silence was stronger. Waiting was stronger. I closed the laptop and leaned back, the weight in my chest shifting into something steadier. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was just a formality. That assumption was my advantage. When the time came, their laughter would collapse under the truth of a signature withheld. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning the edges with precision. The skyline outside glowed gold in the late afternoon sun, but my mind was already back in Boston. The smell of champagne, the sting of Rachel's mock toast, the way my parents had looked away. I exhaled slowly, pressing the bitterness down, until it became resolve. There would be a reckoning, and it would not be loud or messy. It would be in ink and contracts and the silence that followed when people realized too late who had been holding the power all along. As the office lights dimmed automatically for evening, I packed my bag and slipped the contract inside. Tomorrow, I would fly back east for the final round of meetings. My seat at the wedding had been next to the kitchen door, but my seat at the boardroom table was one no one could ignore. And soon enough, even the people who had spent a lifetime dismissing me would understand exactly how much I had been holding back. The music swelled again as waiters glided between tables, carrying trays of champagne, their polished shoes moving in rhythm with the orchestra. I sat at the edge of table 19, my fingers brushing the rim of a water glass, as if its cool surface could ground me. To my left sat Samantha Brooks, the woman who had once been my confidant in college dorm rooms, the one who had sworn she would always have my back. Now she was a corporate attorney in New York, sleek and unshakable in her black dress, her hair twisted into a perfect knot. I waited for her to meet my eyes to acknowledge the sting of Rachel's latest toast, but all I saw was a faint smile tug at her lips before she looked back at her wine. It was a small movement casual to anyone watching, but to me it was a blow. I had thought if anyone in this room would understand, it would be her. Instead, she sipped quietly, letting the moment slide away, as if it had never happened. Mark Williams drifted over next, a man who used to linger at campus parties telling me I would go far. His hair was thinner now, his voice rougher, but his smirk was the same. He leaned against the chair across from me, his voice pitched just loud enough for the people nearby to catch. Lauren still thinks she matters, but sitting back here, who even remembers her name? A few chuckles rippled around the table. One woman shook her head with a grin. Another man raised his glass as if the joke deserved a toast. My jaw tightened. My hands curled into fists beneath the tablecloth. Samantha did not speak. She did not shift, did not even frown. She just glanced at Mark, then back down at her drink, choosing the safer path of silence. The betrayal felt heavier than the laughter. It was one thing for family to dismiss me. That had been happening my whole life. But Samantha had once listened to my tears at 2 a.m, had sworn she saw my worth. Now faced with the same dismissive chorus, she chose convenience over loyalty. A server passed by offering flutes of champagne. When he reached for my glass, Samantha subtly angled her arm to block mine, claiming the last one on the tray. The gesture was so slight no one else noticed, but I did. It was the quiet withdrawal of solidarity, the announcement that she would not be seen standing with me. I lifted my water instead, pressing it against my lips, pretending the sting on my tongue was bubbles rather than bitterness. Across the ballroom, mirrors lined the wall, reflecting the glitter of chandeliers, the shimmer of gowns, the glow of admiration that bathed my sister, at the center of it all. My reflection was there too, pushed to the edge of the glass dimmer, smaller, almost fading into the shadows. I stared at that image, the woman who looked alone even in a crowd of 200. My throat burned, but no tears fell. I would not give them that. My silence had been read as weakness for years, but tonight it was something else. It was armor. Mark drifted away, eventually satisfied with his jab. Samantha leaned back, phone glowing briefly in her lap, as she typed something, probably confirming a client dinner for next week. She did not look at me, and I did not look at her. The distance between us was more final than any words could be. The orchestra shifted into a brighter piece, the kind of song meant to fill the air with celebration. I listened, but heard only the echo of my own resolve. My hand tightened around the glass until my knuckles ached. I let the cold seep into me, steadying my pulse. I was isolated, yes, but isolation carried its own clarity. I turned slightly, catching my reflection once more in the mirror. My eyes were steady, my chin lifted, a quiet defiance etched in the line of my mouth. They thought I was cornered. They thought I was diminished. But I was not finished. Not yet. The laughter from the front of the room rose again as Rachel waved to the crowd, basking in their adoration. I let my gaze rest on her a moment longer, then set down my glass. The time for patience was not over, but it was thinning. Something else was coming, and this time, I would not be left voiceless. Rachel's laughter rang out again, this time, sharper, aimed squarely at me, as she stood near the head table in her white gown. She tilted her head, her eyes glittering with satisfaction, and made another comment about how I was probably more comfortable with spreadsheets than people, how success was wasted if no one wanted to celebrate it. The words rippled through the tables, and I felt the room lean into her performance. Before I could steady my breath, my father Charles appeared at her side, his glass of bourbon lifted high. His booming laugh filled the space. Lauren has always been too serious. He told the crowd, never learned how to enjoy life. He shook his head as if I were a child who never figured out how to play. Guests chuckled, some nodding in agreement, as though it were a harmless family anecdote. My chest tightened, but my face stayed still. Then my mother Evelyn glided forward in her silver gown, pearls catching the light. She placed a gentle hand on Rachel's arm and turned toward me with that soft, poisonous smile she had perfected. "Do not ruin your sister's big day, Lauren. Let's keep it joyful." Her words were honeyed, but every syllable carried the weight of dismissal. The laughter swelled again, no longer at Rachel's joke, but at my parents' approval of it. Their silence had turned into complicity, their complicity into entertainment. I felt the walls of the ballroom closing in. The string quartet played on, but their music sounded like static behind the ringing in my ears. Around me, faces blurred into a sea of smirks and half-hidden glances. A man at the next table whispered something to his wife, and they both laughed, eyes flicking in my direction. It was not one voice mocking me now. It was all of them emboldened by the sight of my family turning me into a punchline. My hands trembled under the table. I curled them into fists and released them again, trying to ground myself. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to wait. But the sting of betrayal cut deeper than the mockery. Rachel's cruelty I had expected. My parents' public endorsement of it carved the wound wider. They had chosen their side, and they had chosen it in front of everyone. I pushed back my chair slowly, the scrape of wood against marble barely audible over the laughter. No one noticed me rise. Their attention was locked on the glowing bride and the smiling parents. I slipped toward the side doors, my heels silent against the carpet, and stepped out onto the terrace. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp, flooding my lungs with relief. The city stretched out beyond the hotel lights glittering against the dark sky, the Charles River gleaming like a ribbon of steel. I pressed my hands against the stone railing, drawing in the chill until my pulse steadied. Behind me, the ballroom shimmered with warmth and noise, but out here, the silence was mine. I turned slightly, catching my reflection in the glass doors. The woman staring back at me looked distant, framed by the glow of chandeliers she no longer belonged beneath. My hair was perfectly styled, my dress elegant, yet the reflection carried the truth of being pushed aside, cut out, laughed at by the people who should have shielded me. For a moment, I saw the girl at 17 staring at empty chairs, the young woman whose ideas had been dismissed at the dinner table. But then my gaze sharpened. There was something new in my eyes now, a flicker of steel beneath the hurt. The reflection no longer looked fragile. It looked steady, even defiant. My breath came slower, deeper, and I felt the resolve settle into my bones. They thought they had silenced me again, that I would retreat into the shadows as always. They were wrong. I straightened, smoothing the fabric of my dress, letting the cold air anchor me. Somewhere inside the ballroom, another round of applause broke out, muffled by the glass. I did not turn to look. My place was not with their laughter. My place was in the truth they had underestimated. I lifted my chin, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The night was only beginning, and so was I. What they had turned into a game of ridicule would soon be decided in a language they could not laugh away, the language of contracts and signatures, the language of power they had forgotten I held. The phone vibrated in my clutch as I stood on the terrace, the cold air biting at my skin. I slipped it open and pressed it to my ear, my voice steady as I answered. It was Daniel Green, Northfield Capital's senior counsel, his tone clipped and precise as always. Lauren, we have reviewed the latest documents. Without your signature, the closing cannot proceed. Condition precedent remains outstanding. If necessary, we will prepare a formal notice to suspend until further instruction. The words struck with the weight of a gavel. Condition precedent. Binding clause. Board approval. All the phrases I had memorized and wielded in boardrooms now echoed against the marble walls outside a wedding where my name was a joke. I closed my eyes and let the power of them steady me. My family could dismiss me in public, but the law did not. Understood, I said calmly. Keep every communication in writing from this point forward. I want the record clear. Daniel agreed without hesitation, his voice as cool as mine. We are aligned. He hung up, and the silence on the line felt like a door closing with authority. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my clutch. The night air seemed less biting now, the ache in my chest dissolving into a cold clarity. I turned toward the glass doors and caught my reflection once again. But this time the eyes staring back did not belong to a woman defeated. They belonged to someone holding the lever no one else realized was in play. I re-entered the ballroom. The warmth hit me instantly, along with the scent of wine and perfume, the swell of violins rising toward another flourish. Conversations buzzed, laughter sparkled. Rachel glowed at the center of her circle. Not one person in that glittering room had any idea that the future of her new husband's company and the deal her friends bragged about was frozen in my hand. As I walked back to my table, a waiter brushed past, nearly colliding with me. He muttered an apology, but I hardly heard him. My pulse was even my steps measured. I slid into my chair at the edge of the room, ignored by those around me, and placed the clutch carefully on the table. Rachel's laughter carried again across the ballroom. A cousin leaned closer to her, whispering, and they both glanced at me before erupting in giggles. I lifted my water glass, my fingers steady this time, and took a slow sip. They thought the game was theirs, but the rules were mine. I let my eyes wander to the chandeliers above each crystal, catching the light. My mind shifted back to the contract in Chicago, the pages where my signature line waited, the place only I could fill. They had called it symbolic, a formality, but I knew better. It was the gate, and until I chose, nothing would move forward. My chest rose and fell in a calm rhythm. I folded my napkins slowly, each crease deliberate, each movement quiet, but sure. Power did not have to roar. It could sit still at the back of a ballroom, smiling faintly, while the rest of the room clapped for the wrong person. Someone at the next table whispered my name, the syllables coded in condescension. I did not turn. I did not need to. My silence carried its own gravity now, and soon that gravity would pull the floor out from under them. I rested my hands flat on the table, palms cool against the linen. The strings soared into another song, the kind meant to signal celebration, but all I heard was the echo of Daniel's words in my ear. Without your signature, the closing cannot proceed. I glanced across the room once more at Rachel, basking in applause, at my parents smiling with pride, at David's composed face, betraying nothing. I felt the corner of my mouth lift slightly. The moment to reveal the truth was drawing closer, and when it came, there would be no laughter left. Rachel's voice sliced through the music, pitched perfectly to command the room. She stood at the head table, her gown sparkling under the chandeliers, her smile sharpened into a weapon. My sister never managed anything in her life, she said, her tone dripping with contempt. A failed career dressed up as importance, nothing more. The laughter that followed was quick, a low wave spreading through the guests. Heads turned, eyes landed on me, expectant, eager for a scene. Forks paused midair, wine glasses hovered. The silence that followed the laughter was heavier than the sound itself. Every gaze pinned me to my chair, waiting for the invisible sister to prove her insignificance by staying silent. My breath was calm, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I could feel the old sting, the reflex to shrink, to endure. But before I could decide whether to speak, movement caught my eye. David rose slowly from his seat, his tuxedo catching the light, his expression unreadable. He lifted one hand, palm out, and the chatter dropped into silence, as if the air itself obeyed him. He looked across the ballroom, then fixed his gaze squarely on me. His voice was clear, resonant, every word carrying authority that no one could mistake. This is Madame Lauren Mitchell. Her sign-off is a condition precedent to our deal. The words cracked through the ballroom like a strike of lightning. A collective gasp rippled across the tables. The meaning sank in instantly. This was not a sister with a little office. This was the woman holding the key to a multi-million-dollar merger, the woman who could withhold her pen and bring everything to a halt. A few whispers erupted, disbelief laced with awe. Did he just say condition precedent? Her sign-off. She holds the contract. The murmurs swelled, then stuttered into applause, scattered at first, and then more certain, as people realized the weight of what had just been said. Rachel froze where she stood, the smile sliding off her face, her hand gripping the stem of her glass so hard I thought it might shatter. My father's brow furrowed, the flush rising in his cheeks, his jaw clenched as if he could swallow the humiliation. My mother lowered her eyes, pretending to adjust her bracelet, her lips pressed tight to hide the tremor. I felt all their eyes on me now, not with pity, not with derision, but with something they had never granted me before. Respect. I did not rise. I did not speak. I only inclined my head slightly, acknowledging David's words with the calm of someone who did not need to argue. My silence was louder than anything I could have said. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly what she held and no longer needed anyone's approval. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came. The room no longer belonged to her. Guests leaned away, whispers circling faster, some clapping again, others watching me with a new calculation in their eyes. The tide had shifted in an instant, and she could not pull it back. I lifted my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with deliberate ease. My pulse was steady. Around me, the ballroom buzzed with the aftershock. But inside me, there was only clarity. They had mocked me, diminished me, seated me by the kitchen doors, but one sentence had undone it all. David sat down again, his expression neutral, but his glance lingered on me a heartbeat longer. It was not sympathy. It was recognition. The applause faded into uneasy murmurs, forks clinking against china as guests tried to pretend they had not just witnessed the ground shift beneath them. Rachel's face was pale, her posture stiff, her eyes darting from me to David to the guests, who no longer laughed with her. I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. The night was far from over. What had cracked open in that moment was only the beginning, and the consequences of it were already on their way. The applause had withered into an uneasy silence, replaced by the hum of whispers that threaded across the ballroom like static. Eyes darted, conversations broke off, and the atmosphere that only minutes earlier had been buoyant now sagged under the weight of David's words. I sat still, letting the silence stretch, feeling the shift settle over every guest like a heavy cloak. From the corner of my vision, Samantha moved toward me. Her heels clicked softly against the marble, her face composed, but her eyes carrying something new, a flicker of regret. She stopped beside my chair and leaned slightly, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "If you want, I can draft the notice tonight. Northfield can send it to Atlas and Carter before morning, formally putting the closing on hold." Her offer was careful, measured, but I caught the edge of guilt in her tone. For a moment, I considered reminding her of her silence earlier, of the way she had avoided me when the room laughed. But I let it pass. This was not about her. I met her gaze, gave a single nod, and said, "Put it in writing." She straightened quickly, relief flashing across her face, and stepped back into the crowd, already pulling her phone from her clutch. Across the room, Rachel's face had drained of color. She clutched her bouquet so tightly that the petals bent, her lips pressed into a thin line as she struggled to maintain her composure. My father's jaw was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, while my mother stared into her glass of champagne, as if the bubbles might explain how this night had unraveled. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding my eyes altogether, others watching me with new calculation, as if trying to rewrite their memory of who I was. I rose from my chair with deliberate calm. The scraping of the legs against the floor was soft, but in the tense silence, it sounded louder than I intended. Heads turned as I adjusted the strap of my clutch over my shoulder. I did not speak. I did not need to. I walked toward the tall glass doors at the edge of the ballroom. Each step measured the fabric of my dress, brushing lightly against the marble. When I pushed the doors open, the cold Boston night rushed in to meet me. The air smelled of the Charles River, and winter rain sharp and bracing against my skin. I stepped onto the street, the city alive with the glow of headlights and the faint rumble of traffic, the noise of ordinary life pulsing beyond the silence I had left behind. For the first time that evening, my chest loosened. I drew in a slow breath, filling my lungs with the chill, and exhaled with steady resolve. Behind me, the ballroom would be buzzing with confusion, denial, and the first ripples of panic. But out here in the night air, there was clarity. I thought of Rachel's voice mocking me, of my parents' laughter that had cut sharper than any insult, of Samantha's silence that had stung almost as deeply. All of it had built to this moment, a moment when truth spoke louder than ridicule. They had wanted me voiceless, but I had spoken in the only language that mattered, and the room had listened. My heels clicked against the pavement as I began to walk, the city lights stretching ahead of me. Power was not always loud. It did not need to shout or rage. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, patient, waiting until the exact moment when its presence could no longer be denied. Strength is not always in the roar. Sometimes it is in the calm breath, the steady gaze, the truth revealed at the precise second when the world least expects it. If you have ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced, remember this: your value is not defined by their laughter. Power waits quietly inside you until the right moment, and when that moment comes, let it speak. What about you? Have you ever been the one overlooked, the one others tried to erase? Share your story. Let your voice be heard, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the weight of justice the loudest. Stay with me, because there are more stories of truth and reckoning waiting to be told.